Hi guys, this is DDBeast here with a special steamy edition of one of my sit-and-go videos for BluefirePoker. Today I'm going to be focusing on something that I'm sure every sit-and-go player would love to learn about and should learn about, and that's adjusting to other rigs and learning how to exploit them and make them hate life, hate you, and take all their monies. Basically, the format I've set up is I've made some initial generalizations about these sit-and-go rigs, and with these assumptions, I'm going to then show you how to exploit them, and then I've even got some in-game examples to show you guys as well. So first off, let's take a look at these generalizations. So first and foremost is extreme nittiness. Sit-and-go players have always had the reputation for being the biggest nits ever, and it's simply true. The VPIPs is standard range of like 12% is pretty common. Even single-digit VPIPs is pretty common as well. There's opening really tight pre-flop. They're just going to be super tight, nitty, weak pre-flop and post-flop. Secondly, we have they have huge disparities in their pre-flop ranges. Just raise folding the majority of their range, just really unbalanced ranges, which takes me to the next bullet point, a lack of balanced ranges in general, not just pre-flop, but post-flop, just everywhere. After that, we have the fact they're typically playing tons of tables, and we can exploit that fact as well. And then the final point is their push fold ranges, which generally seem to be far too much on the tight side for the most part. So these are my generalizations. Let's break it down a little further. So the nittiness, like I said earlier, characterized by the extreme weak tight play, pre-flop and post-flop, and a general overvaluation of the preservation of chips. Rigs, in the current state of the game, rigs just get really carried away with ICM when it just doesn't have as big of an impact as they think it does in the early stages, and they think that they're just holding on to chips for dear life because they're just gonna have this huge edge at the end game when the blinds are big and it's push fold. And problem is, it's just not like that anymore. I mean, it's not 2005 where you could just get to the 100, 200 blinds, just open jam all day, and everyone fold, and fish would limp and fold. Times have changed. I mean, even fish are pretty competent, well, relatively competent at push fold ranges. I mean, they know the drill, they know what's going on, and they've really picked up on it a lot. And the rigs become a lot better at push folding as well. So it's the early game nittiness is, well, there's just not much of a point to it anymore because you don't really have that much of a future edge. It's really a solved game, although people still play the end game really poorly. So there's definitely an edge to be had in the push fold. I don't want to confuse that. But say that you're saving your early edge for a future edge, I think you're just leaving a big pile of chips on the table. Particularly these regs that just have these ranges that are extremely exploitable. They're just really leaving a lot of chips on the table is what it comes down to. And I think it's vastly superior to have those chips than to just fold away and blind down and get to 50, 100 and you have 800 chips at that point. So how are we going to exploit this? Basically, we're going to play more hands in position. We're going to try to get heads up with the rigs, which sounds funny. Usually we're trying to get heads up with the fish, but honestly, I just don't mind getting heads up with the rigs at all, because they're just going to be checking and calling. They're just going to be playing really straightforward, honestly. So you want to get involved just by flatting wider than normal. Definitely 3-betting wider. I can't express enough how strong 3-betting is. Well, actually I can. exactly express it. Alright, so this is make it a CO versus button situation. Typically, CO reg will open, I've got 13.5%. We can take a look at that as well, which is, this is 13%. It's something along the lines of this, which is still looks pretty tight for a CO open. I'm opening wider, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they're opening this tight, and then I have them defending 3.5%, which seems absurdly tight, but it really is the range that they're defending against a 3-bet. Let's see if I can get it in there. Basically, comes down to tens through aces, although usually they're folding tens as well. I guess you could leave that in there some of the time. Basically ace king and ace queen suited maybe they throw in there. Just defending really tight. I mean, compare this to the 13.5% opening range. It's just absurd, the disparity in the amount they're raising to fold to a 3-bet. And you don't have to make it big. Well, another leak of these regs is they're making it 90 at 15.30, which I think is pretty bad in a late position. I mean, I would make it 75 at most, I think. And this allows you, basically just gives you a good price in your bluff. You can just make it 210. You don't have to make it big at all. These 3-bets do not need to be large, because I think they're going to play relatively the same. I think they're going to be pretty inelastic, regardless of your 3-bet size. So, yeah, I mean, you make it 210 over their 90 bet, and you just show an immediate profit. They're going to fold 74% of the time, almost three-quarters of the time they're folding, which is just crazy. So, just assuming you can get immediate profit by 3-betting any 2 cards. Obviously, you can't do that because they'll eventually pick up on it and not allow that to happen. At least they should. But theoretically, you'd be gaining 45 chips every time you did this, assuming you just lost or folded the pot when they did play back at you, when they called or shoved or whatever, which is obviously not the case. You're going to win it post-flop a lot too when they flat. So it's just massively plus EV. I mean, 45 chips doesn't sound like much, but these dimensions are kind of exaggerated a little bit. So it's probably a bit more than that, and you have the post-flop edge where you're going to be in position and just betting them out of the pot constantly because they're just going to be ultra nits. So 3-bet in position. I cannot stress it enough. That is the best way to combat against regs. Moving on, isolating weak limps for sure, and just generally being aggro, blind versus blind against regs. Yeah, Synagogue regs just do not balance their limping range whatsoever. There's very occasionally I'll see a reg limp aces under the gun or something like that. But I mean, they're just folding. Well, they're just having really weak hands just all the time. It's just always going to be a medium pair, maybe like a king queen suited or something like that. The thing is, their range will be very narrow, and for the most part, they're just going to fold your ISO anyway. So you again should just show immediate profit, and it's just going to be really difficult for them to play out of position. Again, I'm talking about isolating them in position. So you're just going to make life really miserable for them, and there's just no reason for you to have that limping on your table. If you see those limps, just scoop them up. They're just going to fold. You can even make it 3 big blinds is usually enough to get the job done because they just don't want to play out of position against another decent player. So it's really important, and best part is even if they do flat, you just have their range nailed down as nothing incredibly strong. I mean, a lot of pocket pairs that you just always bet them off of unless they hit a set, and they'll pretty much always let you know if they do hit a set. So you'll hear from them, and it will be very easy to bet them out of the pot if they do not hit anything. Which again brings me to the next point, just barreling. Just barreling like crazy. Once they go into check call mode, that's just like a green light to just take the pot from them. They're just giving you the pot. If they're checking and calling on a texture where they would just always raise with a strong hand, they're just never going to showdown with it ever. They might call the flop, might even call the turn, but they're never going to make it to showdown. It's just going to be really bad play. Um, After that, this is almost kind of counterintuitive. Betting smaller for value and bigger as bluffs. 'Cause usually against fish, you want to do the opposite. The differences with these regs is they don't want to play big pots at all. They're still really in the preservation of chips mode. Uh, just can't play big pots in the early game. You have to save your future edge. So once the bets start getting big and once there's all-ins involved, they just cards the muck like crazy. And for that reason, when you do have your stronger hands and you are betting for value, it makes sense to bet smaller because they're just gonna have such a huge folding range that that's gonna be the only way you can possibly get value. So again, yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive how I usually play against, I don't know, reasonable players. But in this case, I think you should actually bet smaller for value and bigger as bluffs. And I don't want to exaggerate that. It's not like I'm always just shipping it in every time I have a bluff and just min betting when I have a value hand. It's going to be very slight differences. You obviously don't want to give off tells and let people know your bet sizing patterns, etc. Although, as we'll see later on, it appears the regs just really don't pay attention to prior history or take note of things like that. But it's still something to be concerned about for the better players. Moving on. So, pre-flop. So, regs pre-flop are just going to be extremely straightforward. They're going to let you know if they have a hand. They're rarely limping strong. Their 3-bet and 4-bet range is extremely tilted towards value. I mean, and when I say that, I mean kings and aces, basically. 4-bet range, it's just so rare that regs 4-bet light, which is understandable because usually they're 3-betting outrageously tight, so 4-betting over that would be kind of suicide. Um, However, they should definitely be 4-betting light against me because I'm just going to be 3-betting like crazy. And I do have to make an admission. It does help that I played sitting goes for so long, so I've been in the games for years, and I used to have like the crazy tight nitty stats. So a lot of these players have, tens of thousands of hands on me with these tight stats and a 3-bet percentage of, 3% or whatever ridiculous low stat. So it really helps me in my case, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it with a fresh database. You will just have to be kind of wary of people picking up on it, but again, they really don't seem to pick up on it very well. So yeah, 3-bet, 4-bet range, that's just going to be so tight. You're just going to, well, the way to play against it is boring, but you should just be folding against them. Pretty simple, really, but that's the way to combat it. They're going to be raised folding a huge percentage of hands as well, particularly in late position. And this goes back to the 3-betting pre-flop. That's how you take advantage of it. In addition, you want to 3-bet a very polarized range. Reason being is when they do 4-bet, it's always just going to be the nuts, basically. So you don't want to be 3-betting a hand that has decent equity that you're now having to give up. You want to be 3-betting, the crappy hands that play well enough post-flop, but you're definitely not going to cry if you have to fold it pre-flop. So that's the reason in this situation you want to have a polarized range. Types of hands, I 3-bet light. Well, because their ranges are so tight and their 4-bet range particularly is so tight, card removal actually plays a really big factor. When their 4-bet range is aces and kings, and you have ace-2, you just knocked out a big chunk of their range, as absurd as it sounds. So using, like ace-2 suited, ace-5 suited, obviously being suited helps. Even like king-7 suited, even has card removal working for it a little bit. Other than that, as I showed you earlier, you can 3-bet any 2 cards and show immediate profit. So you can 3-bet surprisingly wide until they start to pick up on it. You just can't get too carried away. And again, combating their tight 3-bet 4-bet range is just to, play tight. You're definitely not going to be 4-bet chipping in light or 5-bet chipping in light until they prove that themselves can 3-bet or 4-bet light. It does leave opportunity for, set mining against their stronger hands, but in reality, I don't really recommend it that often because, again, they're just going to be folding post-flop so much, they're just going to be really nitty, and they're just looking to make those hero folds all the time, whether it's due to just not wanting to think about it, they're playing too many tables and don't want to focus on it, laziness, or they just don't know any better. I don't know, but they're just going to be super nitty, and it's going to be hard to get value from them when you do hit a set. And typically, this is obviously really situational, but typically it's not worth it to set mine in a lot of spots where I see regs set mine. Moving on. Unbalanced ranges. Okay, so post-flop, they're very often folding the top of the range. Well, they're basically folding their entire range. So you can really take advantage of this. Basically, you just have to not be afraid to ship it in on the river. Sometimes you're gonna 3-barrel. Sometimes you'll get called and bust. It'll happen, but you're just gonna make so many chips in the long run, just because there's literally so many spots on the river where they just do not have a calling range. They'll peel one on the flop and they're like, okay, call on the turn. And river, they're just folding so often. Reason being is because they're vehemently against slow playing. They want to play their hands fast. They want to reduce variance to the lowest amount possible, and they don't want to play a big pot without the pure nuts, basically. So to combat this, you make them play a big pot without the pure nuts and make them fold, essentially. More unbalanced ranges. Again, I talked about this earlier. They never limp strong hands. I should say, extremely rarely limp strong hands. Particularly blind versus blind. Having a rig limp into your blind is just free money all the time. And you don't even have to make it big. Depending on stack sizes, if you're at 10-20, I would usually make it, 60 or even 50 would be sufficient. But say you're at 100, 200, and you have 15 big blinds, you can basically min raise back. They limp for 200. You can make it like 420. They're getting 3-1 odds, but they'll be out of position, and you'd be amazed how much they fold. And if not, just fold the flop. They're just really, really easy to take advantage of blind versus blind, because again, they're just never limping strong hands. They're just going to limp and fold a huge frequency of the time, and if they do not, they will be folding the flop a huge amount of the time. Moving on. Again, they never slow play post flop. Check calling range is always relatively weak. They're just never trapping you. They're always going to let you know if they have a big hand. Particularly on the textures, the wetter textures where there's all sorts of draws to protect against. They're just going to be, check raising, leading into you if they have any strong hand. Anytime they check call, again, it's just green light, just bet, 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 take it down. More range imbalances there, never triple barreling all in. I should say almost never. I kind of exaggerate when I say never, but it's extremely rare that they will triple barrel all in. Usually it's a flop C bet, and if that doesn't work, I'm like, oh shit, I give up. The one and done strategy. Maybe they'll fire a second barrel sometimes, but again, they're not looking to play a huge pot, and certainly not looking to bluff off their entire stack when they haven't even got into their huge edge in the late game yet, where they get to push forward and make all this supposed money. So they're just not going to be making huge bluffs in general. So you can actually get away with making nitty folds yourself. You can fold big hands to them if they do start putting on the heat, because they're just always going to have it, essentially. They're just not going to be messing around. After that, we have the fact that they rarely check raise a river, and certainly never as a bluff. Um, it's just always going to be for value. Again, they're always going to have it. Same thing goes for the flop. They're just rarely going to check raise air and just barrel off. Unlike cash games, which just can be really common, I mean, all the time. But sitting goes, they're just none of that craziness. Um, so yeah, I said this before, take advantage of the spots where rigs don't have a calling range and just make those barrels. And again, ISO, ISO, ISO. Raise their small blind limps all the time. They're just leaving money on the table and just begging you to take it. I think I covered this. And yeah, proceed cautiously versus multi-street betting from tight rigs. So the mass tablers, nearly all these sit-and-go rigs are mass tabling because sit-and-goes deal with really small edges. I mean, I would mass table myself. I would play 15 to 20 games at a time, which I'd say was pretty typical. Maybe a bit on the high side, but there was definitely some who played well over 20. So the majority of them are going to be playing lots of tables. So what does this mean to us? It means they're going to be generally unaware of frequencies, or maybe kind of out of the loop. Game flow. I mentioned game flow, but game flow is kind of silly when you have, just stats on all these players and extended history. I mean, if a rig shoves 3 hands in a row, it's not like he's going to be. Not like you should expect him to have done it extra light in that scenario, unless he happens to be tilting. So game flow is a little overrated. But game flow with random players does come into play, and they may not be exactly sure what's going on there. They just kind of go into robot mode and just make all the same decisions for. It's basically like I have 8 big blinds in the cutoff. I shove X hands. So how you should combat this is you should not put emphasis on metagame. You shouldn't think about. I don't know. It's kind of silly to get in these leveling wars when they may not have even seen the hand, or they may not even. They may have just like clicked on another table really quick and not even seen showdown. So it's kind of silly to base things on metagame and prior histories as well as your image. Another consideration to take is they may be unaware of random players shoving range. So how does this affect you? Let's say, for example, you're in the small blind, sit-and-go rigs on the button, and a random, a fish, or whatever's in the big blind. He may just have a set shoving range. Like, I'm on the button with 9 big blinds, I shove X hands. I think that's very common thinking for sit-and-go rigs. And the big blind may be just an absolute maniac and just calling anything, where the button should be tightening up his range significantly, but he's not. So that affects you because it's going to affect your calling range certainly. If he's not making the adjustment that he should be, you have to be aware of that, and you have to be aware of which players particularly do that. I guess a similar example I could give is, say you're on the bubble and there's just this maniac shover that they've been playing too many tables to kind of realize, and they shove over him. It's hard to know whether they're shoving their normal reshove range or they're shoving over him because he's a maniac. But I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't paying attention a lot of the time because they're playing so many tables and are in sit-and-go robot mode. So in addition to that, we have the fact that they're very poor note takers. Notes are so important in any form of poker. They're important in sit-and-goes. They're just huge. Any form of poker. I mean, there's been several times where I've been making a tough decision and just kind of on the fence. Then I happen to check the notes really quick, and it's like I see something. It's like, this guy just has no clue what he's doing. Just turns like maybe like a borderline fold and just do a snap call. I mean, having those notes is worth so much money. And the kind of notes you should be taking is, against other regs, you should know who's limp folding, or the few that are limp raising and checking to give up. You should know about the few regs that are 4-bet bluffing. You should. What I typically like to do is basically just, well, anytime there's showdown, theoretically you should be taking notes, unless everyone played the hand perfectly, which almost never happens. You should be taking notes, which again is tricky to do when you're playing 15 tables or however many, but it really is worth it. It's so clutch to take notes. Yeah, anytime I take showdown, I notice a reg play a hand strangely or differently than I would. I just take a note of the action really quick. You can kind of create your own little shorthand note-taking language. Not very hard to do. Um, and it's definitely important to take notes on randoms too, because yeah, you probably won't see them again, but if you do and you know that he's just a complete fish, having that note is just so advantageous, compared to just seeing a random dude at the table next time you play. Notes are so clutch, and I think players play tons of tables and just kind of give up on it and don't bother with taking notes and rely on their stats and think they can remember everything. But it's so huge. Take notes all the time. Um, yeah, again, this is back to the kind of back to the nittiness, but regs will make folds simply to avoid the decision. Really, just getting into a tricky decision because they simply don't have time. They've got 15 other games waiting and got timers beeping, and it's kind of a fuck it, I fold mentality because they're very busy at the time. So again, you combat that with just extreme aggression post flop, well, pre flop as well. Moving on, push fold ranges. All right. So I actually said earlier that people have gotten pretty competent at push fold ranges, which is true compared to the past, but I still think people play pretty bad. Um, Typically, some specific examples are reg versus reg blind battles. I mean, I don't know if these guys just don't use sit and go whiz at all or what, because they were just shoving insanely tight, just way too few hands that they should be from the small blind. They should just be shoving so much more, and in addition to that, they're just calling very tight. Well, I guess basically they've adjusted to each other's ranges, but they certainly haven't adjusted to mine, because they call my small blind shoves just incredibly tight, and again, just leaving chips on the table. Um, I mean, I really don't know why. It's like the simplest scenario you could possibly have, and it's really easy to do in sitting go whiz. So I just really don't understand why they're not shoving. I mean, maybe they're concerned about giving up their edge, like minimum edge setting is too high, which I think is kind of bogus myself, because you're already dealing with really small edges in sit and goes. For the most part, I'm taking anything I can get. Um, there are certain exceptions to that, though. But for the most part, blind versus blind, they're just playing way too tight, shoving and calling. Furthermore, when there's antes in play, again, they're just way too tight, calling and shoving. Particularly when you get to the 100, 200 with 25 ante level, and sometimes there's still 6 players at the table, 7 players at the table. When you're on the button and there's 175 in the middle, plus the 200 big blind, plus the 100 small blind, that's a big chunk of change, especially when you have 1,400 chips. When you can add 475 to your stack, when you can add a third of your stack size, that's just outrageous. And it's really simple to see in sit and go whiz. They should be shoving a really wide range, but regs just don't do it. Again, I don't know why. Maybe they're just. I mean, you can't lose if you don't play, I suppose. But I mean, they're just leaving chips on the table, and there's no reason they shouldn't be shoving very wide there. And conversely, I am shoving very wide in those spots, and they're simply just calling way too tight. Um, then 6-man sit and goes. I mean, I'll probably do a whole nother video comparing 9-man and 6-man sit and goes. But the regs that do translate from 9-man to 6-man sit and goes are just playing way too tight. typically the ranges are going to be looser in six-mans, and they just don't adjust well. They just don't make the looser shoves and calls that they should be making. So, yeah, just their push-fold ranges in general are just going to be way too tight. And I have to combat that is to assume they're on a tight range until proven otherwise, which is kind of how I guess my same approach to randoms, and the fact that I assume they're terrible until proven otherwise. For the regs, I just assume they have a tight range until proven otherwise, but usually it's pretty easy to get a good idea of their ranges. The unfortunate part is it's really easy to see how loose someone is calling, but it's very difficult to see how tight they're calling, for the obvious reasons that they don't show their cards when they fold ace-10 or whatever. So you really have to go through Hold'em Manager or Poker Tracker or whatever and go back and dissect the ranges, and I'll probably show you briefly how to do that quickly towards the end. So again, you should be shoving wide yourself, particularly in the blinds when there's kind of these super nitty tight calling ranges. Secondly, regs, I said this before, regs often have a template range that they don't cater to specific opponents, so they're not changing the range for, amongst different regs, which they certainly should be, because all regs have different ranges in all spots, and it's I know it's difficult to keep up with, especially with your playing tons of tables, but if you want to play well and maximize EV, you're going to have to learn it, and it's certainly worth going through Hold'em Manager and breaking down ranges. It's definitely worth the time, especially if someone's at, 14 of your 15 games. I mean, you need every edge you can possibly have on that person. You're going to play so many hands with them. It's so crucial that you just have their ranges down solid. You know exactly what they're shoving and exactly what they're calling every time. Every situation is completely worth the time to dissect the ranges while not playing. Thirdly, we have kind of an exception to the tight push-fold ranges that I said. In my experience, they generally make a lot of negative EV calls in the bubble, or just calling very wide on the bubble, particularly if you're shoving, under the gun or from the button. This is a very big generalization, but in general they seem to call much wider than their prior nittiness suggests. So it's kind of strange. It's kind of like I guess they've been saving up their chips all this time to have this future edge, and they really want to get everything out of that edge they can. And in my opinion, they try to get too much out of it. So to combat that, you should be aware of these players that are making these loose calls and tightening up your bubble shoving range accordingly. And again, for these template ranges that players have, you should know who's doing this and who's using these robotic strategies, so that you're not changing your range for the situation. Again, when I used the prior example where he's shoving the button, you're in the small blind, and he's not adjusting to the big blind's range, that affects you as well. So we got an example hand. Blinds are 15-30. This is actually a 9-man sitting go. Effective stacks are 14-25. I have 14-25. He slightly covers. This is a rig that opens to 90 in the cutoff. He's actually a good rig in my opinion. I think he's a lot better than most rigs. I'm not a fan of his open to 90 though in the cutoff. Like I said earlier, I think 75 is optimal, or rather less than 75 is optimal when you have 50 big blinds or so. But regardless, I 3-bet to 210, which would be my standard size. Again, it's pretty small. I mean, it really doesn't need to be any bigger than that. They're just you're giving yourself a really good price. You're risking 210 to take down 135, and you're going to do it, as I showed you earlier, about 3/4 of the time, which is just insane. So you can do it really loose. This 10-7 suited is pretty loose, but I've done crazier things. I mean, they're just folding so much, and you can just do it until you stop getting away with it simply, and they just let me do it all the time, so I keep doing it. So anyway, moving on. He does call, and we're heads up. So when he calls, I'm basically putting him on a range of jacks, queens, kings, aces, maybe tens, discounted range for tens, as well as a discounted range for aces and kings, because they're going to be four betting definitely the majority of the time. It's actually pretty rare that they flat out of position with aces and kings. In position, they will certainly do it, but out of position, it's rare that they flat with aces or kings. Again, because they're trying to take the low variance route and not have to make difficult decisions and not play big pots where they're unsure of their relative hand strength, basically. So they're going to be four betting those a lot of the time. So anyway, ace king, aces and kings discounted. Queens, I think queens actually get four bet some of the times, but I think flatting there is pretty reasonable for most rigs. Jacks definitely get flatted. Tens are discounted because I think they get folded sometimes. And I'll throw an ace queen suited as well. I think ace queen's kind of on the borderline, on the border. So maybe some call ace queen off, but I think a lot of them just throw it in the muck. Maybe they call ace queen suited. Maybe that's the cutoff. So again, that's a super tight range. It's like 3.3%. It's just so few hands when they're opening 13.5% or whatever I said earlier. So flop is ace king queen with two clubs, giving me a flush draw and a gutter. Let's check this out on Flopzilla. So I've got 10-7 clubs. I'm going to give him a range. We're going to discount aces and kings as well as tens for reasons I mentioned earlier. We'll say like 35% that they do have it. Flop, we got ace of clubs, king of spades, queen of clubs. Alright, so Flopzilla is pretty fucking cool. It breaks down their absolute hand strength based on the range you provided. So 20% of the time he has a set. Usually or the vast majority of the time it's going to be queens because I've discounted aces and kings. He's going to have two pair nearly half the time, which seems strong, but I'm quite certain that he's going to fold it by the river every time. And then this weak pair is jacks or tens, which he has almost 30% of the time. What happened here? There we go. So majority of his range is two pair, and he does have sets on this flop sometimes. My perceived range is very strong on this flop. I could have all three sets. I could have two pair with ace king. I don't know if ace queen is in. Well, I'm not three betting ace queen, but I don't know if he knows that. So it's possible that ace queen is in my range as well. Basically, if he thinks I'm three betting jacks plus, which I'm not even three betting jacks. Again, I'm three betting a very polarized range for reasons I mentioned earlier. So in his eyes, it may even be, I've got sets, aces, kings, queens, or two pair, and that's it. In this particular situation, I know this guy knows I'm capable of three betting light, but I think he has no idea as to what frequency I'm doing it. So basically my plan for the hand, I do have, you can see I've got a 37% equity, 37.3% equity on this flop against this range, which is actually pretty good. However, I'm not thrilled about getting it in here. I'm starting to sound like a nit myself, but here's how it could go down. So if I do bet the flop and get check raised, he's basically always going to have a set. I think check raising two pair there against my perceived range, the range that he thinks I have, would be pretty bad because he's just going to run this sets a lot and just be absolutely crushed. So I expect two pair to check call, and I expect sets to check raise, and I expect that to be the way they play the hands nearly all the time. So if that's the case, I'm not thrilled about getting in my draw against a set on this flop, and I'm almost certain that I can barrel him off two pair in the future, and even sets as well. Again, his most likely set is a set of queens, and I can certainly rep aces or kings quite easily. So I think the play here is to check back. Assuming, okay, so yeah, he checks, I check. Move on to the turn, and I pick up a 7, which is pretty irrelevant. I mean, I guess I could river another 7 and beat his 2 pair, but he checks. So it was basically when he checked, I thought the majority of his range was jacks and 10s, because I expected sets to bet 100% of the time. I expected ace king to bet pretty high percentage as well. And if he does have ace queen, I mean, there's only 3 combos of ace queen left. If he does have ace queen, I usually expect him to bet those as well. But even if he doesn't, and he does check call with ace king or ace queen, I can still barrel him off on the river because I do have those sets in my range. I will check back the flop with those because my perceived range on that flop is very strong to him. So, and I don't want him just, make some nitty fold with, ace queen future on, later on. So I think checking back the flop with a big hand is reasonable. So I can still rep those aces and kings, queens, etc. So there's 465 on the turn. I bet small, with good reason. I think the majority of his range is jacks and 10s, even though 10s are really hard to have because A, I've discounted his range because I think he folds it some of the time pre-flop, and B, I have one in my hand. So really it's going to be a lot of jacks in my opinion. And I size it small, reason being if he does have jacks, then I think he's folding to a small bet 100%. I don't think he's going to peel one off here. So basically I'm giving myself a really good price on the bluff. On the other hand, if he does have 2 pair that he's checked to me, then I also like betting small for the reason being I bet 200. If he calls, there's going to be 865 in the pot. I don't think he's ever going to check raise again because I can still have these really strong hands in my range, and he can't now because he's checked twice. So I expect him to call if he does have 2 pair. I bet 200 and he does call. So I now think that ace king, ace queen is the majority of his range. Maybe a set of queens if he's playing them really passively and really scared that I have a bigger set. It's certainly possible. But I use the small sizing, A, to get a good price on bluffing out jacks or the unlikely 10s, and B, I set up a big river bet. So it's going to put 865 in the pot, and I've got roughly 1,000 behind. So I can jam it in on the river, and as we learned previously, these regs do not like to play big pots. They don't like to play for all their chips early on. They don't like to make the big calls. They will happily make these hero folds and move on. Then something unexpected happens. I plan on bluffing every river, jamming every river, and then something terrible happens and I actually make the nuts. So I hit the jack on the end, and it's kind of interesting. Villain does check to me, and my options are this. I can bet small. I can bet 300, like 325 or something like that, and have a wider value range, kind of repping, like sets trying to get value. I don't know. Basically, just give him really, really enticing pot odds to call with his 2 pair or unlikely set of queens. Basically, just maybe should probably even bet smaller than that. Actually, if I'm going to bet from here the small route, probably bet like 250. Just force him to call with 2 pair, or even smaller actually. But my option is a small bet, or I can jam for 1,000. The jamming is getting into kind of like a leveling spot, because I mean, how the hell can I have a 10 here, really? I don't 3-bet pocket 10s pre-flop. He should know that. I'm pretty sure he's aware of that. So I would just have to have some absolutely random 10. You would have to put me on a complete bluff pre-flop. So basically I bet 1,000 chips, because I thought this particular reg was actually capable of calling in a spot like this because he does have hand reading abilities, and he might realize that my hand doesn't really make any sense, and why would I bet so big, etc. Um, I could certainly take that line with aces or kings as well, because aces and kings are definitely the nuts at this point, as far as I'm concerned. Um, but if he does have two pair and I jam, it is enticing to call because, well, maybe. He does have blockers to aces and kings as far as sets, and if he has the ace king, raise queen in his hand, and again, my line just doesn't make much sense. So I decided that jamming is the best line. Um, I don't expect to get called often, but I think I'll get called. It's gonna be a small percentage of the time, but I think I'll have more EV than the tiny bet if I wanted to bet like 200 on the river or something like that. So I'm basically hoping to get him leveling more and hoping he snaps me off here, but unfortunately he folds. Sorry about that. So I've got one more example hand. I'm just going to bust this out in the replayer because I actually had the hand history for this one. I couldn't find the other one. But very similar spot. Gets raised in the cutoff. I 3-bet Jack 10. This particular villain, I've hidden his name for identity's sake, but this particular villain I think is a little looser than the last one as far as his defending range, which means Jack 10 might be a slightly worse hand to do it with because he may have it's probably fine because he may have Ace Jack suited in there and tens and stuff like that. But I still think it's going to be massively plus EV to do this. So again, he makes it 90, which is too big. Just no reason to make it that big at this blind level with those stacks. I make it small. I make it 210. Really, you could probably even go smaller than 210 and give yourself even better price and deeper stacks to work with post flop. But anyway, he calls, and again there's 465 on the flop, and I flop middle pair with a gutter. We can check out his range here as well. Different flops. So we got Queen of Clubs, Jack of Diamonds, 8 of Hearts, and I have Jack of Hearts, 10 of Spades. And I'll give him a couple more hands. That should be sufficient. I'll throw in tens too. Fuck it. So we see that he has a set 11%, over pair 12%, top pair 20%, ace high 45% of the time. It's actually a pretty strong range because I mean he does have ace high 45% of the time, but it is overs and a gut shot, so it's not the worst. And he's gonna have sets and top pair, which seems relatively strong, but all of these hands, well, except the sets, I think I can barrel him off if he does play it passively. So again here, I think the play to start off is to start off by checking, because I certainly don't want to get check raised here. I do have relatively decent equity against his range. Wow, I'm a favorite. Yeah, it's kind of surprising. I guess I gave him a kind of looser range than usual. But yeah, I definitely want to protect my equity here, and I don't want to get bet out of the pot. So I do check behind once he checks to me. Turns a king, which is interesting. So now I'm open-ended instead of just the gutter. And again, he checks to me. This is just green light. Go ahead and bet. And I can still get it in on 2 streets with big bets. I can bet 300 here. It'll be 1065 in the pot. Then I can jam for 900. So again, I'm trying to keep these bets big so I can have maximum fold equity against these nitty rigs. So when he checks to me on this texture, he just loses. He now has 0 sets. He has no 2 pairs. He could have ace king. I guess aces are the top of his range. If he, again, if he didn't 4-bet those pre-flop, and he's playing them tricky. But again, he's gonna fold the river. He's just gonna fold his entire range by the river when he checks this texture. He's just it's just free chips on the table. Um, so yeah, I bet 300 here. I I don't expect to get check jammed on because I would expect him to bet anything that he check jams. Um, he does call. So at this point, I'm thinking he does have ace king or ace queen. Ace king or ace queen seems pretty reasonable. Aces are possible too, that he's kind of pot controlling, but I'm simply just not gonna let him pot control. I'm gonna get it in. Um, so I brick, but that's fine. I'm still planning on jamming any river because my perceived range is just stronger than his. Um, I can still have aces. I can have kings. I can have ace king. I could potentially have a set that I checked back, but my range is just so much stronger than his, and he's just gonna have to fold like a little girl every time. Um, and he does, and I take it down. So that was a couple of examples. Real quickly, I wanted to show you this poker tracker. Um, I wish I could use Hold'em Manager because it definitely seems to be the superior software, but I can't seem to get it through my monkey brain. I just tried downloading it today, and it's a big hassle to transfer files, etc. But anyway, sorry to single out Asian Tracker in this one, but I've got tons of hands against him because he plays tons of games, and I'm in a lot of them with him. So what I've done is filtered it down for heads up. Um, I mean, you can filter it down for any amount of players at the table, but this is kind of the most basic level. Heads up against me, and there's an all-in pre-flop, and these are all the cards he does it with. I like to start at the bottom of the range, seeing the trash that's getting shoved first. You can actually use Excel to make note of the effective blinds that they're shoving, and you can start to extrapolate an entire range for them from 3 big blinds up to 15 big blinds. They're shoving 15 big blinds. You can just go up the list and plug in every hand. I mean, admittedly, you do need someone that you have a lot of hands against. So that is a factor. But if you play with any regularity, it shouldn't be hard to do. And the thing is, any information you get whatsoever will be good information and be very valuable, especially if you're playing against someone as much as, for example, the two of us are playing together. So this information is just so crucial to have, and it's just at your fingertips. You can see when they're shoving 5-3 off. You can just see what hands they're shoving with X amount of blinds. It's just so huge to have. Alright, well, I think that's all for this one. I hope this has been extremely informative, and I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I hope you enjoyed the hot, steamy intro. And next video, I'll go back to some 6-man videos. Let me know how you liked kind of like the outline of this presentation and the layout. I'm kind of a PowerPoint noob, so I haven't really done anything like this. But let me know what you guys think of the format in general. If you want me to do more concept and theory videos or other stuff like this, I'll probably think of more stuff against regs, I'm sure. But yeah, give me some feedback. Let me know what you guys think. It's DDBeast signing out.